Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've gone through very many of my projects, you'll see that about half of them use SMD or surface mount device components. Now, in the guitar pedal world, there has been a lot of debate over the years about the use of surface mount components. There have been concerns about whether or not the components sound the same. There have been concerns about whether one type of construction is higher quality than another. And a lot of the debates surrounding these things are just opinion that really doesn't have a whole lot of basis in fact. Now, for my day job, I work in high end consumer electronics, and I can tell you that a lot of the really expensive audio equipment that you're buying out there uses surface mount components, and they do it to really great effect. Now, I spent many years, the first probably 10 years of my pedal building journey, only doing through hole components. The thought of using surface mount components kind of scared me a little bit because they're so tiny and because I would have to buy all new stock of components and I wouldn't be able to use something like perf board or Vero board. I would have to, get PCBs manufactured. But once I took the plunge into it, it has really opened up a lot of possibilities for my pedal building that I wouldn't have had beforehand. And so today we're going to go through just 5 or 6 of the main reasons why you should consider changing to surface mount components. Now, I'm not advocating that you do a wholesale change from through hole to surface mount. In fact, even with my surface mount boards, I still use some through hole components simply because they're easier to get or they're more convenient or they're easier to work with. For example, electrolytic capacitors aren't really any smaller necessarily on a surface mount board, and so I use through hole electrolytic capacitors for a lot of it. Now, the first point that I want to make about surface mount is its size. And that may seem pretty obvious because they're a whole lot smaller. But I'm not talking just about the size of the components themselves, because the size of the components allows us to take advantage of either a fixed enclosure size so that we can get more circuit into an enclosure. It can make it so that we have smaller storage space for our components. And it also means that we don't have to worry about certain things with placement as much. Now, for example, with the storage of components, I have this big set of tackle boxes and storage compartments that I keep all of my through hole components in. And now for my surface mount components, I keep pretty much the entirety of my surface mount components in this little container here. It's got 144 little snapping compartments. I have all of my resistors, all of my capacitors, all of my semiconductors in here, and I still have a handful of open compartments that don't have anything in them. And so when I close it all up, that is the size of all of my surface mount components. Way less space than the through hole components that I've got stockpiled. And honestly, with things like passive components and everything, I have way more of them in here than I have in my tackle boxes, because each one of the little compartments in here can fit literally hundreds and hundreds of a particular component. The next thing on size is obviously that you can get more circuit into a certain size of an enclosure. And this is really helpful because sometimes you may come up with a circuit that's really big and it can be really hard to get it into an enclosure that makes any kind of sense. I've got a couple of really massive circuits. The Echo Rec, the T60 reverberator, the reverberatory, those are all circuits that use a ton of components. They're all based around multiple PT2399 chips. And in the case of something like the T60 Reverb, for example, there's no way I could have put that into a 125B enclosure without going surface mount. There simply wouldn't be enough space to put all of the components in there and still have room for the switches and the jacks and all those kinds of things. So that's the size aspect. Next up is actually cost. Per component, surface mount is way cheaper. For example, resistors. Through-hole resistors, it's pretty common to get them for about 1 cent each. That's US money there. But for resistors, you can get them for 4 and 5 times less expensive than that. You can buy them in, 50 or 100 at a time, and it's the same cost as buying, 10 or 20 through-hole resistors. And so you have way more components for the same amount of money. Also just the fact that like ICs tend to be cheaper in the surface mount packages. And so when it comes down to cost, you're just using much less of everything. Your board sizes are smaller, so you're paying for less board area. The amount of solder that you need is way less, so you're consuming way less solder than with through-hole. Just those kinds of things. It all starts to add up. The next aspect is actually parts availability. And this is really easy to see with something like the J201 JFET. They have not been made in a through-hole package for several years now, but there are tons of DIY designs that use them. And so there's a lot of people go through a lot of trouble or spend a lot of money on either through-hole parts or on JFET parts with a surface mount adapter to be able to continue using these through-hole circuit boards or these through-hole layouts when the parts are never going to be made in the through-hole package ever again. It's just going to get harder to find them. They're going to get more expensive. And so switching over to surface mount actually makes it so that that's a lot easier. In addition to that, there are a ton of new parts coming out that are only available as surface mount components. A lot of the most cutting edge parts are only being released in surface mount packages anymore. And that is because that's the way the mass electronics industry is going, and us as guitar pedal builders are the smallest of fish in the pond that the component manufacturers have to account for. So changing to what is available really allows us to be able to do things that we wouldn't be able to do very easily otherwise. So parts availability is really kind of a big thing. The next thing is the ease of modification. I enjoy getting on the breadboard and breadboarding out a circuit and everything and seeing if some crazy idea will work. When it comes to like dialing in fine values, a breadboard is not the best way to do it necessarily, because you've got all of these long leads and wires all over the place. And so you can be picking up stray noise, and it can be really hard to tell the difference between a small tweak in like capacitor values or resistor values or something like that. And so what I do now is I use my breadboard to get the architecture right. I make sure that all the building blocks are all working together and the controls are working the way that I want them to and everything. And once I'm happy with the architecture, I will make sure that I put in the component values that are just kind of my best guess at the time, but I don't stress about it too much, because when a surface mount board comes back, changing out a part on a surface mount board is way easier than on a through-hole board. Take capacitors, for example. If you use like a film box capacitor, you've got to, get on the underside of the board and heat up the one lead and pry it off and the other lead and pry it off. And if you've already got like your potentiometers in there, you may have to bend the potentiometers out of the way to access the backside of the capacitor. And it's just really a hassle. And with a surface mount board, all you have to do, like on a resistor or a capacitor, is you just hit one side with the soldering iron for a couple seconds, hit the other side with the soldering iron for a couple of seconds. It all heats up, and you can swipe it right off the pads, no big deal, and you can put a new one in seconds. So here I've got a surface mount circuit board all ready to solder up, and I just wanted to give a quick little rundown of just how easy it is to put a component on here and to remove one for the ease of modification part. So I've got this circuit board here. These are my tweezers. I use this pair for just about everything, and you can see that I have tinned one pad for every component on here. And what that does is it allows me to tack the component in place at first, and then I can solder the other side. And the tip that I'm going to be using is this hooked tip that comes down to a very fine point here. And actually, this has become my go-to tip. I use this for through-hole components, surface mount components, potentiometers. I use it for everything except for soldering guitar wiring. So I'm just going to take my little resistor here that is ready to be put on, and I actually am just going to put it on a random pad in here because this isn't the right value for whatever this is, but I just put it onto that pad and I heat it up a little bit there and I tack it into place. And then I can come in here and I can solder the other side. I've got my super fine solder here, and with the hook tip I can just hook it around, a little touch, and it's all soldered just like that. There's no leads that need to be clipped or anything. Now, if this was the wrong value or I put it in the wrong place, removing it is really quite simple. Because it's so small, I can just give it a little bit of heat for a couple of seconds and it swipes right off the board, and I haven't damaged any pads. I can reuse this component if I really want to. I can put a new one on. I don't have to worry about cleaning out any clogged holes like what happens with surface mount components. And that's all there is to it. It's really quite simple. Putting together a surface mount board, the most difficult thing is getting all of the components out of the little compartments using just the tweezers, because your fingers aren't going to fit in there. You have to remember that these parts are made to be put in an oven with lead-free solder, which requires really high temperatures, and to basically just be baked in an oven with the circuit board and the solder until the solder reflows. And so hitting it with your soldering iron for 10 seconds or whatever isn't going to hurt most parts. Also, if you have to rework like an IC, say a dual op-amp package, for example, desoldering a through-hole dual op-amp package can be kind of a pain. But with a surface mount one, you just get your hot air station and you just kind of blow the hot air on it for a little while until the solder softens up, and you use an X-Acto knife or a dental pick or something to lift it up off the pads, and away you go. You're ready to put a new one in. So the ease of modification is a whole lot better. Another thing that I really like about surface mount components is board assembly services. We've seen the proliferation of places like JLC PCB and PCBWay and OshPark, where we can now get circuit boards so easily that even 10 or 20 years ago, we would have thought it was almost impossible to do. The price point is bottom of the barrel type thing, but they also tend to offer these PCB assembly services for surface mount components, because the surface mount components were made in large part to aid in the automated population of circuit boards. And so the pick and place machines are made to just put these components down really precisely, really quickly. And the cost of the board assembly services and of the parts when you get them assembled is really quite low. And so if you get 5 assembled circuit boards, it can be as inexpensive as $6 for the board and the parts and the assembly all in one go. And if you've got a big circuit, like something that has a whole ton of passive components, having just the passive components put down for you can save so much time. Yes, you do have to pay the initial board setup fee or the assembly fee or whatever, but it still works out to be really inexpensive if you value your time for anything. And then you can be left with just, placing either the more expensive components or the more exotic components that they don't carry, or just the components that you may already have on hand or that you want to be extra sure with, you can place those by hand and it's no big deal. So the board assembly services really help change the game a lot as well. Now, there are a couple of things to consider before making the leap into surface mount. The first thing is, are you going to be designing a lot of your own boards? Because if you design a lot of your own boards and you are space conscious, then surface mount is great. But if you're going to mostly be buying prefabricated boards from someplace like Pedal PCB or PCB Guitar Mania or one of those other sites like that, then it may not really make sense to start making a shift to surface mount because a lot of those boards are still all designed through hole. But if you're going to be doing a lot of original designs or original layouts, and especially if you're going to be doing big circuits, it's a great thing to consider. Another thing to consider is how well you will fare with the little parts because they're really tiny. And I work with 0805 components mostly, which are considered a pretty big surface mount component, but they're still several times smaller than the through-hole equivalents. And if you've got really bad eyesight, or if you have really poor lighting, or if you, for example, if you have something like hand tremors or something, then surface mount may not be the best way to go necessarily, or at least not hand-populated surface mount. It may be better to stick with through-hole, and that's not a problem. But if you're putting together a lot of circuit boards, or if you have, a good work area and, you've got a reasonable magnifier or glasses or eyesight or something, then it can also be a really great idea. Now, the final thing to consider is that you will need to make some kind of an investment. It's not a very large investment, which really surprised me. I thought I would need to get myself a microscope. I thought I'd have to get like a specialty soldering iron. I thought that I was going to need, a bunch of stencils and flux and solder paste and things like that. But really all I've bought has been some superfine solder, so some 0.015 inch diameter solder, one really fine soldering tip. It's actually a hook soldering tip that I'll show you here, and a good pair of tweezers. They don't have to be expensive, but you don't want to get like the $2 AliExpress tweezers. Trust me, I've tried several pairs of them, and it is much better to just buy like one $10 or $15 pair than to buy a whole bunch of $2 and $3 and $4 pairs, which won't work very well for you. And then also some kind of magnification. It can be a magnifying glass, it can be a microscope if you want, but I just use like this $2 loupe, 10 times magnification loupe that I got off of AliExpress for as cheap as possible, and it works great. I use it for my quality check after I have gone through and soldered all the components. I will then put the loupe in and go through really carefully, looking at every solder joint, making sure that the solder joint is actually connected between board and component, because it's really easy to miss if you are just using the naked eye. Also, you want some kind of good organization. My container here that I showed you earlier was, I think I spent maybe like $20 on this container, or $25, but it's made by Aidtech. It's considered like, a professional quality box for storing things like this and whatever, and it has worked really, really nicely, and you really only need one of them, so it ends up working out really well. So there are my thoughts on switching to surface mount and why you really should give it some consideration. See if it meets your needs, and then don't be afraid to make the jump. It can be a little nerve-wracking, thinking, oh man, they're so small, this is going to be so hard to work with, but it's really not all that bad. And so I hope that this was useful information for you, and we will catch you next time. Thanks a lot for watching.